Roy here. I'm 39 years old. This is not a calm story. This is not a motivational talk wrapped in soft words. This is anger. This is pain. This is the kind of revenge that doesn't scream. It rebuilds and leaves scars on the people who thought they broke you. 15 fast ways to forget your ex-boyfriend. Forget your ex. If those words feel impossible right now, if they make you angry, if they make you want to throw your phone across the room, then good. That means you're listening with the right part of your body. Like this, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from because pain like this doesn't belong in isolation, and neither does what comes after it. I'm not here because I healed beautifully. I'm here because I burned first. Let me tell you something nobody told me when I was drowning in memories of someone who walked away like I was disposable. Forgetting an ex is not about moving on. That phrase is weak. That phrase is designed to rush you into silence so other people can feel comfortable. Forgetting an ex is about detaching power. It's about reclaiming pieces of yourself you handed over without realizing you'd never get them back. Right now, if you're honest, your ex still owns real estate in your head. Not because they're special, but because you invested. You built routines around them. You planned futures with them. You imagined versions of yourself that only existed with them next to you. And when they left, they didn't just take themselves. They took that version of you with them. That's why it hurts. Not because you lost them, because you lost who you were becoming. I remember waking up and reaching for my phone like muscle memory, knowing there would be nothing there and still hoping. I remember replaying conversations like crime scenes, searching for the exact moment I could have said something different, been better, been quieter, been easier to love. I remember the humiliation of realizing I would have stayed while they had already decided to leave. That realization poisons you if you let it, because it plants one dangerous thought in your mind. I wasn't enough. And I need to kill that thought right now. You were enough. You were just loving someone who benefited from you not realizing it. Forgetting your ex is not about erasing memories. You can't erase what shaped you. Forgetting your ex is about destroying emotional dependence, and not is violent work, not in action, but in discipline. This is part one, and part one is where you stop lying to yourself. You're not fine. You're not over it. You're angry, you're hurt, you're obsessed in ways you don't want to admit. And that's okay, because anger is fuel when you stop turning it inward. Right now, you are probably doing at least 3 things that are keeping them alive in your head. You check their social media, you replay their words, you imagine them missing you. That last one is the most dangerous, because fantasizing about their regret keeps you emotionally attached to someone who is no longer paying rent in your life. It keeps you waiting, and waiting is weakness disguised as hope. I waited. I waited for texts that never came. I waited for apologies that stayed in my imagination. I waited for closure like it was something another person could hand me. And while I waited, I was bleeding. Here's the first truth you need to swallow, even if it chokes you. Closure is a lie sold to people who don't want to let go of fantasy. You don't need closure, you need control. Part one is about accepting the loss without romanticizing it. You didn't lose the love of your life. You lost someone who chose life without you, and that matters. Because love that leaves quietly while you're still trying is not love. It's convenience. It's someone taking what they needed from you until they didn't anymore. And if you're angry hearing that, good. Anger means the illusion is breaking. Revenge does not start with revenge fantasies. It starts with clarity. Here is what you must do in this first part, even if it hurts more before it hurts less. You stop telling the story or you are the victim waiting to be chosen again. You stop asking, why wasn't I enough? And start asking, why did I tolerate being half-loved? You stop pretending you want them back when what you really want is relief from withdrawal. Because make no mistake, this is withdrawal. Your brain got used to dopamine tied to one person, their voice, their validation, their presence. When that disappeared, your system panicked, not because they were unique, but because your nervous system hates sudden absence. And withdrawal lies. It tells you they were perfect. It tells you no one will compare. It tells you pain equals meaning. That is chemical, not spiritual. I remember sitting in my car late at night, gripping the steering wheel, feeling rage mixed with longing, hating myself for missing someone who didn't miss me back. I remember the shame of wanting someone who had already shown me how easily they could walk away. That shame will eat you alive if you don't weaponize it. Here's the revenge nobody talks about: becoming unreachable to the version of them that only wanted you when it was easy. But you can't do that yet. Not in part one. In part one, you grieve, but you do it without self-pity. You say out loud, "They chose to leave. They chose a life without me. And I refuse to chase someone who made that choice." Say it again. Say it until your chest burns. Because forgetting your ex is not about forgetting the memories. It's about breaking the belief that they still get access to your emotions. This part hurts because it's honest. It hurts to admit you loved more. It hurts to admit you waited. It hurts to admit you would have stayed. But here's the pivot, the moment this stops being sadness and starts becoming power. You don't need to be chosen again. You need to choose yourself in a way you never did while you were with them. Part one ends when you stop asking for relief and start demanding transformation. You don't get better by being gentle with the truth. You get better by staring at it until it loses its grip. This is where the forgetting begins. Not with distraction, not with another relationship, but with anger sharpened into discipline. If you're still listening, you're ready for the next part. Because part two is where obsession turns into rage, and rage becomes the first real step toward freedom. This is the part nobody wants to talk about because it's ugly. This is the phase where you're not sad anymore, you're obsessed, where your mind circles one person like a wound you keep touching just to confirm it still hurts. If part one was honesty, part two is exposure. I need you to hear me clearly. Obsession is not love. It is attachment screaming because it lost control. And if you don't understand that, you will confuse pain with loyalty and addiction with destiny. After they left, my days didn't fall apart all at once. They fractured. I'd function in public, work, errands, conversations, then collapse in private. My mind would rewind moments without permission. A laugh, a look, a promise that now felt like a lie. I wasn't missing them. I was missing the certainty that came from believing we were us. Obsession thrives on that uncertainty. You wake up with their name already in your mouth. You check your phone without thinking. You calculate time zones, routines, habits. You imagine scenarios where they suddenly realize they made a mistake. You imagine messages they never send. You imagine running into them looking better than ever, just to see regret flicker in their eyes. That fantasy is poison. Because while you're rehearsing imaginary reunions, your real life is on pause. I know the tricks obsession plays. It pretends it's reflection. It pretends it's processing. It pretends it's healing. It's not. It's bargaining. It's the mind saying, if I replay this enough, maybe I can change the ending. You can't. The ending already happened. What you're doing now is trying to resurrect control. And here's the hard truth that made me furious when I first understood it. The person who left is not thinking about this as deeply as you are. They moved because moving felt lighter. You stayed because staying felt loyal. Those are not equal investments. Obsession makes you feel loyal. Detachment makes you feel guilty. That's why people stay stuck. I remember stalking their social media like it was evidence, reading captions for hidden meaning, analyzing who liked what, who commented, who appeared in the background of photos. I told myself I was just curious. I told myself it didn't mean anything. It meant everything. Every click was another dose. Every scroll was another hit, and every hit reset the healing clock. Here's something nobody tells you when you're heartbroken. Your brain doesn't care about dignity. It cares about familiarity. It will drag you back to what's known, even if it hurts more than the unknown. That's why you keep checking. And then there's the anger. Not clean anger, not empowering anger, the kind that turns inward, the kind that asks, why them? The kind that fantasizes about revenge, not because you want to hurt them, but because you want proof you mattered. That's the core of obsession, the need to matter again. I wanted them to miss me. I wanted them to feel the absence the way I felt it. I wanted symmetry and the pain. And the fact that I couldn't guarantee that made me feel powerless. Powerlessness is addictive. It keeps you stuck because movement feels risky and stillness feels familiar. So you sit with the ache and call it patience. You call it time. You call it just a phase. No, it's a trap. And here's where the anger needs to turn outward, not toward them, but toward the pattern. Ask yourself this without mercy. What exactly are you hoping for? An apology? A reunion? A message that proves you weren't disposable? Even if you got it, would it heal you or reset the cycle? I realized something that made my stomach drop. If they came back, I would have accepted less than before just to avoid losing them again. That's not love. That's fear negotiating. Obsession shrinks you. It makes you quieter, more accommodating, more willing to erase yourself. And the longer you stay in it, the more you teach your nervous system that your peace depends on someone who chose not to protect it. That realization made me furious, not at them, but at myself. I was angry that I was spending my energy monitoring someone who no longer chose me, while neglecting the one person who needed me most, me. That anger is necessary, because part 2 is where you stop romanticizing your suffering and start calling it what it is, a dependency you didn't consent to consciously, but must end intentionally. Here's the first act of psychological revenge, and it has nothing to do with them. You starve the obsession. Not gently, not slowly, decisively. You stop checking, you stop asking mutual friends, you stop revisiting places and songs and memories that keep the wound open. You don't do this because you're weak. You do it because discipline beats longing every time. I remember deleting apps just to break the habit. I remember the panic that followed, my hands itching, my mind racing. That panic is proof you were addicted, and addiction doesn't end with willpower. It ends with structure. Obsession hates structure, so you build it. You schedule your day so tightly there's no room for spiraling. You replace scrolling with movement. You replace rumination with exhaustion, not to punish yourself, but to interrupt the loop. And when the thoughts come, and they will, you don't entertain them. You label them. This is withdrawal. And you let them pass like weather. You do not argue with them. You do not explain yourself to them. You do not seek meaning in them. You let them starve. Because here's the revenge nobody prepares you for. Indifference is built, not felt. You don't wake up free. You train into freedom. Every day you don't check is a day you reclaim power. Every night you sleep without replaying is a night you steal back your future. And yes, it hurts at first. It hurts because obsession feels like connection. But connection that costs your self-respect is not connection, it's captivity. Part 2 ends when you accept this. They don't need to regret it for you to move on. Their regret is irrelevant. Your life is not a courtroom waiting for a verdict. You don't need them to miss you. You need to miss yourself less. This is the stage where anger stops being chaotic and starts becoming useful. It sharpens your focus. It hardens your boundaries. It teaches you that longing is not destiny. It's chemistry. And chemistry can be rewritten. In the next part, we cut the cord. Not emotionally, practically. Because part 3 is where you do the thing that terrifies attachment the most. You disappear. This is where most people fail, not because they don't want to heal, but because they're afraid of the one thing that actually works, disappearing. Not theatrically, not with announcements, not with dramatic goodbyes. I'm talking about the kind of disappearance that leaves no trail, no access, no emotional oxygen. Because here's the truth that burns. You cannot detach from someone who still has access to you. You can pretend, you can delay, you can cope, but you cannot detach while the door's cracked open just in case. I cracked that door for too long. I told myself I was being mature. I told myself I didn't want to be cruel. I told myself silence felt childish. But underneath all of that was fear. Fear that if I disappeared completely, they'd forget me. And that fear kept me chained. Cutting contact is not about punishing them. It's about ending the conversation your nervous system keeps having with someone who is no longer present. Every message, every checking in, every accidental encounter resets the bond. It tells your brain, this person is still relevant. Relevance is the drug. So I cut it. I blocked the number. Not muted, not archived, blocked. I unfollowed, not quietly watching, gone. I told mutual friends, calmly, without drama, I don't want updates. I stopped going to places I knew they might show up. I didn't do it because I was weak. I did it because I was done bleeding for entertainment. The silence that followed was terrifying. No notifications, no reactions, no new information. Just space. And in that space, my mind panicked. What if they reach out and I miss it? What if this is the wrong move? What if I regret this? That's the addiction talking.
Addiction hates finality. It wants options. It wants access. It wants the illusion that something might still happen. But here's the thing nobody tells you. Hope is lethal when the relationship is dead. Hope keeps you negotiating with a ghost. Hope keeps you available to someone who already chose absence. Disappearing feels like death at first because you trained your body to orient around them. Your day had checkpoints, good mornings, check-ins, shared rituals. When those vanish, your system doesn't know where to land, so it reaches. That's when you must not. I learned to sit in the discomfort without acting. I learned to let the urge rise and fall without feeding it. I learned that urges peak and collapse like waves, if you don't chase them. And something strange happened. The silence started working. Not immediately, not gently, but effectively. Without new input, my brain stopped inventing narratives. Without access, fantasies lost fuel. Without updates, comparisons died. Without proximity, the bond weakened. That's not cruelty, that's biology. You can't starve a fire while adding oxygen, and access is oxygen. Here's where the revenge begins to shift from fantasy to fact. When you disappear, you stop performing grief for the person who left. You stop being available as emotional reassurance. You stop being the backup plan. You stop being the audience for their life. And they feel it. Not because you announce it, but because the dynamic changes. The mirror disappears. The validation dries up. The familiarity goes quiet. But listen to me carefully. Their reaction is not the goal. If you disappear hoping they'll notice, you're still attached. The goal is freedom. I remember the day I realized I hadn't thought about them for hours. Not minutes, hours. It shocked me. Not because I didn't care, but because my mind had finally found something else to hold on to. That's the power of disappearance. It gives your mind room to attach to you again. You start noticing things you ignored while you were emotionally occupied. Your appetite, your sleep, your energy, your anger. Now cleaner, more focused. You start reclaiming time that used to be wasted on monitoring someone else's life. And with time comes dignity. You stop wondering what they're doing. You stop waiting for regret. You stop needing confirmation that you mattered. Because here's the hardest truth of all. You don't need proof that you mattered. You need proof that you matter now. Disappearance creates that proof, not by making you invisible, but by making you unavailable. And unavailability changes the balance of power immediately. I don't mean power over them, I mean power over yourself. You're no longer reacting, you're no longer checking, you're no longer negotiating, you're choosing. That choice is where revenge transforms, because the real revenge is not being seen thriving, it's being unreachable while you rebuild. It's not offering them the satisfaction of watching you heal. Healing in private is a flex. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped giving updates. I stopped being nice. Not cruel, just done. And in that quiet, something unexpected happened. My anger sharpened into resolve. I wasn't trying to forget anymore. I was building a life that didn't include them by default. I was rearranging my world so they no longer fit anywhere. That's not bitterness, that's alignment. Part 3 ends when you accept this. Disappearance is not avoidance, it's a boundary that protects your future from your past. You don't owe access to someone who opted out. You don't owe explanations to someone who left. And you don't owe presence to someone who chose absence. The cord is cut here, not emotionally, practically. And once it's cut, the next phase begins. Because part 4 is where you take the memories, the objects, the places, the triggers, and you destroy their power. Not by pretending they don't exist, but by reclaiming them. This is the part where people hesitate because it feels extreme. This is where they say, "Isn't that too much?" This is where they cling to objects like relics, like memory is something you can curate without consequence. They're wrong, because memories don't live in your head alone. They live in rooms, in drawers, in clothes, in songs, in places you pass every day pretending they don't still own you. Part 4 is where you strip the environment of emotional traps. And yes, this is where the anger becomes useful. I used to tell myself I was being sentimental, that holding on to things was healthy, that memories mattered. What I didn't understand was this. Sentimentality is just attachment wearing a softer mask, and attachment feeds pain. So I stopped being soft with it. I started with the obvious things, the gifts, the clothes that smelled of them, the notes I told myself were too meaningful to throw away. Every object had a story attached to it, and every story reopened the wound. I picked them up one by one and felt the pull, the urge to keep, the voice that said, "What if one day you want to remember this?" I didn't want to remember. I wanted to move. So I threw them out. Not ceremoniously, not dramatically. I didn't cry over each item. I didn't apologize to my past. I didn't take photos for closure. I put them in a bag and removed them from my life like toxins. And it felt violent. Good. Because emotional detox is violent to attachment. Then came the harder part, the spaces, the couch where we used to sit, the side of the bed they slept on, the kitchen corner where conversations happened, the routes I drove because they were familiar. Familiarity is dangerous when it's tied to loss, so I changed it.
I rearranged furniture until the room no longer held the same geometry. I changed where I slept. I replaced light bulbs, curtains, smells. I repainted walls if I had to. I stopped letting the environment whisper their name. You think this is cosmetic. It's not. Your brain maps emotion to space. When you change the space, you break the loop. You interrupt the automatic recall. You force your mind to reorient. I stopped listening to music that took me back, not because the music was bad, but because it was hijacking my nervous system. I replaced it with noise, with movement, with anything that didn't allow me to sink. And when a song slipped through and hit me unexpectedly, I didn't romanticize it. I turned it off immediately. No lingering, no soaking, no suffering as proof of love. Suffering is not proof of anything except endurance. I stopped going to places that made me nostalgic, cafes, streets, views. Not forever, just until they lost their charge. I refused to let my past dictate my present routes. This is where revenge starts to feel clean. Not because you're destroying reminders, but because you're reclaiming territory. You're saying you don't get to live here anymore. I remember standing in a room after everything was gone, rearranged, changed. And for the first time since the breakup, the room felt neutral. Not sad, not heavy. Neutral. Neutral is powerful. Neutral means no emotional ambushes. Neutral means peace has a place to land. Then came the internal objects, the rituals, the morning habits, the check-ins, the ways I used to think. Those needed demolition too. I stopped narrating my life to an imaginary version of them. I stopped thinking they would have liked this or they would have hated that. That mental audience had to die. Because as long as they were watching in my head, I wasn't free. So I started doing things on purpose that they would have disliked, not to spite them, but to prove to myself that my life was no longer calibrated to their preferences. I ate differently, I dressed differently, I spoke differently. And every time I felt guilt rise, I named it for what it was: conditioning. I wasn't betraying love, I was undoing training. Here's the part nobody prepares you for. Anger peaks here. Because as you remove reminders, you start seeing the relationship clearly, without filters, without nostalgia, without fantasy. And what you see isn't always flattering. You see compromises you made that cost you yourself. You see boundaries you abandoned to keep peace. You see moments you stayed silent to avoid being left. That realization hurts. But it also liberates. Because anger directed outward destroys. Anger directed inward corrodes. But anger directed at patterns creates change. I stopped asking why they left. I started asking why I stayed as long as I did. That shift is seismic. And here's the revenge embedded in this part. You are dismantling the version of you that needed them. You are killing the dependency that made their absence devastating. Dependency is not love. Dependency is fear dressed as devotion. As the environment changed, my body followed. My sleep improved. My breathing slowed. The constant background ache dulled. Not disappeared, but dulled. And that's progress. People think healing is about feeling good. It's not. It's about feeling less dominated by pain. Part 4 ends when your space no longer speaks their language, when you can sit in your room without being pulled backward, when your routines belong to you again, when memory loses its ability to ambush. This is not erasure. This is reclamation. And once your environment stops betraying you, the next phase begins. Because part 5 is where anger stops being reactive and starts becoming discipline. This is where revenge becomes visible, not to them, but to the world. This is where anger finally stops shaking and starts aiming. Up until now, anger was raw. It flared, it burned, it hurt you almost as much as it motivated you. But here is where anger becomes discipline. And discipline is dangerous in the best possible way. I used to think revenge meant being seen, being admired, being desired again so they would finally understand what they lost. That fantasy is childish. It keeps your life orbiting someone who already exited your story. Real revenge is quieter. Real revenge is building a life so solid that their absence becomes irrelevant. This is the part where you stop explaining your pain and start converting it. I woke up one morning angry, not at them, but at time. Angry that I'd wasted energy bleeding for someone who slept fine without me. That anger didn't scream. It whispered, "Get up." So I got up. I started training my body like it owed me money. Not for aesthetics, not for attention, for ownership. I needed to feel strength again. Real, earned strength that comes from doing hard things when no one is watching. I lifted until my hands shook. I ran until my lungs burned. I pushed until my mind went quiet. Pain became useful. Pain became familiar. Pain became something I controlled instead of something that controlled me. That's the difference. When you suffer on purpose, you stop suffering by accident. I stopped drinking, not because I was trying to be pure, but because numbness was slowing me down. I needed my anger sharp. I needed my mornings clean. I needed my nights earned. I started eating like my body mattered, sleeping like my future depended on it, planning like I was finally in charge. And here's what happened. The chaos inside me began to organize itself. Anger loves structure. Without structure, anger destroys. With structure, anger builds. I stopped asking, how do I forget them? And started asking, who do I become if I never need them again? That question changes everything. I set goals that scared me, goals I'd postponed while I was busy loving someone else, goals that required focus, sacrifice, and time. And every time my mind tried to drift back to them, I dragged it forward by force. Not gently, firmly. This is where revenge stops being emotional and starts being material. You build skills, you increase your value, you raise your standards. Not so they'll notice, so you'll never tolerate that level of neglect again. I remember the first time I looked in the mirror and didn't see a wounded person staring back. I saw someone disciplined, someone contained, someone dangerous, not because they were angry, but because they were focused. Focus is terrifying to people who thrive on chaos. And something else happened. The fantasies stopped. Not all at once, but gradually. They lost urgency. They lost color. They stopped feeling like unfinished business and started feeling like old noise. That's the real revenge. When someone who once dominated your thoughts becomes background static. I didn't announce my progress. I didn't post motivational quotes. I didn't hint at transformation. I stayed silent and let consistency speak. Silence plus growth is lethal to the past. Because here's the truth. People who leave you expect you to fall apart publicly or heal visibly. Either way, they stay central. But when you disappear into discipline, you rob them of both outcomes. They don't get the satisfaction of your suffering. They don't get the validation of your display. They don't get access. That's power. I learned to love the grind, the repetition, the boredom, because boredom meant my mind was no longer chasing ghosts. Boredom meant peace was creeping in unnoticed. And in that peace, something shifted. I stopped wanting them to regret it. I stopped caring if they remembered me. I stopped measuring my worth against their absence. That's when revenge was complete, because the final form of revenge is indifference earned through effort. Part 5 ends when anger becomes momentum instead of memory, when discipline replaces longing, when routine replaces rumination, when your future starts pulling harder than your past. In the next part, the shift becomes visible, not just to you, but to the world around you. Because part 6 is where identity is rebuilt, not as a reaction, but as a declaration. This is where something fundamental changes, not on the surface, but underneath everything. This is where you stop being someone who went through a breakup and start becoming someone who outgrew a chapter. Up to now, everything you've done has been corrective, cutting, removing, rebuilding structure, turning anger into discipline. Necessary work, hard work. But this part is different. This is not about reacting to what they did. This is about deciding who you are when no one is watching. I didn't wake up one day feeling confident. That's a lie people tell when they want to sound healed. Confidence came later. What came first was identity fatigue. I was tired of being defined by loss, tired of carrying a story that wasn't even mine anymore, tired of explaining myself internally to a person who wasn't listening. So I stopped narrating my life through the lens of the breakup. That sounds simple, it isn't. Because when someone leaves, they leave a vacuum, and that vacuum tries to define you if you don't fill it deliberately. If you don't choose an identity, pain will choose one for you. I decided I was done being the one who was left. I became the one who left behind the version of himself that tolerated disrespect. That decision didn't come with fireworks. It came with quiet resolve. I stopped introducing myself in my own head as someone recovering. I stopped measuring time, and since the breakup, I stopped framing growth as compensation for loss. I wasn't rebuilding to prove anything. I was rebuilding because I finally had space. Here's the part nobody warns you about. When you start becoming solid again, people around you feel it before you do. They talk to you differently. They listen longer. They sense boundaries even when you don't announce them. Not because you're louder, but because you're clearer. Clarity is magnetic. I stopped over-explaining. I stopped justifying choices. I stopped seeking permission for how I lived. And the strangest thing happened. I started trusting myself again. Not in a dramatic way, in small moments. Choosing what to eat without considering anyone else. Making plans without checking if they'd approve. Saying no without rehearsing excuses. Those small acts are identity bricks. Brick by brick, I built someone who no longer needed validation to feel real. I took risks that had nothing to do with love. Career moves, creative projects, physical challenges. Things that reminded me I existed outside of intimacy, outside of being wanted. And every risk survived without them. That mattered, because once you prove to yourself that your life functions, thrives without a specific person, dependency loses its grip. I didn't rush into another relationship. That was deliberate. Not because I was scared, but because I wanted to know who I was when no one was attached to me emotionally. I wanted to meet myself again. And I did. I met someone calmer, sharper, less forgiving of bullshit. Someone who listened to discomfort instead of explaining it away. Someone who didn't confuse intensity with depth. This is where revenge turns invisible. Because when you rebuild identity correctly, you don't need to be seen winning. You know. You walk differently. You speak differently. You choose differently. And the past no longer has authority. I realized one day that I no longer framed my standards as because of what happened. They were just standards, period. No more tolerating inconsistency. No more chasing clarity. No more shrinking to keep connection. Those rules weren't about them. They were about me. Identity solidifies when you stop asking what went wrong and start asking what will never happen again. That question becomes your compass. And here's the part that feels like revenge without effort. When your identity stabilizes, the past loses emotional leverage. You can remember without spiraling. You can acknowledge without reopening wounds. I could say their name without a physical reaction. I could think of moments without nostalgia hijacking me. The memories didn't disappear. They just stopped demanding attention. That's power. Not the power to dominate. The power to remain unmoved. Part 6 ends when you realize this truth. You are not healed because it stopped hurting. You were healed because pain no longer decides your behavior. In the next part, something interesting happens. You stop looking back, and suddenly, they do. Because part 7 is where absence starts echoing back toward the person who created it. Not because you planned it, but because growth has consequences. This is part 7. This is the part people fantasize about when they're still broken. This is the part they think will save them. And I need to be very clear before I go any further. This part only happens if you stop chasing it. because the moment you want this to happen, you're not ready for it. Part 7 is not about them coming back in a movie-style apology. It's not about dramatic regret or public embarrassment. It's not about you winning an argument that never really mattered. It's about something far more unsettling. It's about absence echoing back toward the person who created it. When I disappeared, really disappeared, something changed in the air. Not immediately, not obviously, but slowly, like pressure building where there used to be noise. At first, there was nothing. No messages, no signals, no reaction. And that's when most people panic. That's when they think, see, I never mattered. That's when they undo months of progress just to confirm relevance. I didn't. I stayed silent. Not because I was pretending to be strong, because I no longer needed proof. And here's the truth nobody likes to admit. People don't feel loss when you're gone. They feel loss when they notice the benefits of your presence are missing. That takes time. It takes time for them to realize you're not watching anymore. It takes time for them to notice you're not reacting. It takes time for the mirror you used to provide to vanish. When you stop feeding someone attention, validation, emotional labor, availability, and patience, they don't immediately miss you. They miss the way you made them feel about themselves. And when that goes quiet, discomfort follows. That's when
A
it
message
starts.
that feels casual but isn't. A question disguised as concern. A hey, just checking in. I remember seeing the notification and feeling nothing. No spike, no rush, no fantasy. Just awareness. That was the moment I knew the power had shifted. Because the goal was never to make them miss me. The goal was to stop missing them. And once that happened, everything else became irrelevant. But here's the part that surprised me, and this is where revenge becomes almost ironic. They didn't come back confident. They came back uncertain. Their messages weren't bold. They weren't romantic. They were probing, fishing, trying to understand who I was now without asking directly. That's what absence does. It creates mystery, and mystery unsettles people who are used to access. I didn't respond immediately. I didn't explain. I didn't re-engage emotionally. I kept my replies short, neutral, grounded. Not cold, just unavailable. And that was harder for them than anger ever would have been. Because anger invites engagement. Indifference ends it. I could feel the imbalance, the hesitation, the shift. They were no longer speaking from certainty. They were speaking from curiosity mixed with regret. But here's the most important part of this stage. By the time they noticed, it no longer mattered. That's the revenge no one prepares you for. Not the moment they reach out, but the moment you don't need to respond to feel whole. I didn't block them out of spite. I didn't ghost them to punish. I simply didn't rearrange my life to accommodate a chapter I had already closed. And that decision hurt them more than anything I could have said. Because it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was final. I didn't need to tell them how much they hurt me. They already knew. And if they didn't, explaining wouldn't teach them empathy. I didn't need to show them how much I'd grown. Growth doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself in boundaries. And that's when I understood the real meaning of revenge. Revenge is not making someone feel pain. Revenge is making someone irrelevant to your peace. They reached out because the silence confused them, because the version of me they left behind was no longer there, because I had stopped orbiting them. And when someone who benefited from your presence realizes you no longer need them, something inside them fractures. Not enough to change who they are, but enough to feel the loss. And that's not your responsibility. You don't owe closure to someone who chose exit without explanation. You don't owe comfort to someone who created your pain. And you don't owe access to someone who forfeited it. Part 7 ends when you understand this deeply. If they come back, it doesn't mean they've changed. It means you have. And that difference decides everything. In the final part, there's no anger left, no revenge fantasies, no looking back. Part 8 is where the story closes, not with triumph, but with freedom. This is part 8. This is the end, not because the story ran out of words, but because it ran out of weight. Nothing pulls anymore. Nothing begs. Nothing waits. Freedom doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives quietly, almost disappointingly. One day you wake up and realize the silence isn't empty, it's spacious. The ache isn't gone, it's irrelevant. The past isn't erased, it's archived. I didn't feel victorious. I felt unbothered. And that was the moment I understood what all of this was for. I used to think closure was a conversation. It's not. Closure is when your body stops bracing, when your jaw unclenches, when your breath deepens without effort, when your mind stops rehearsing arguments you'll never deliver. Closure is when your life no longer asks questions your past can't answer. I stopped checking the door. I stopped wondering if they'd come back. I stopped measuring my days against a loss. Not because I became stronger than pain, but because pain stopped being a teacher. There's a point where lessons repeat, where grief circles, where anger turns stale. When that happens, growth demands a different posture. It demands release. I forgave. Not for them and not out loud. I forgave by letting go of the version of myself that needed their validation. I forgave by choosing peace over performance. I forgave by refusing to carry a story that didn't belong to my future. Forgiveness is not reconciliation. Forgiveness is dropping the rope. And when you drop it, you don't fall. You stand still while the tug of war ends. I stopped telling the story of what they did. I stopped introducing myself through the wound. I stopped making pain my personality. That doesn't mean I forgot. It means I integrated. I can remember without flinching. I can acknowledge without reopening. I can speak the truth without needing agreement. The past became a chapter, not a destination. That's freedom. I learned that love should feel expansive, not consuming. That loyalty should be mutual, not begged for. That peace is louder than passion when passion costs your dignity. And I learned something else, something I wish I had learned earlier. You don't win by proving you mattered. You win by building a life where your worth is not debated. The best revenge isn't success, it's sovereignty. It's choosing where your energy goes. It's guarding your attention like it's sacred. It's saying no without explanation. It's leaving tables where respect isn't served. I don't hate them. Hate requires investment. I don't love them either. Love requires presence. What I feel now is distance, clean distance, the kind that lets you breathe. If they think of me, that's theirs. If they regret, that's theirs. If they remember, that's theirs. What's mine is this life, quiet, focused, honest. I rebuilt it without applause. I defended it without aggression. I chose it without permission. And if you're listening to this at the end, here's what I want you to understand. Forgetting your ex is not about deleting a person. It's about removing them from the control panel of your emotions. It's about choosing discipline over drama, structure over spirals, self-respect over self-abandonment. You don't need to rush this. You don't need to perform healing. You don't need to announce your growth. You need to live it, quietly, consistently, without looking back. Because the moment you stop looking back, the road opens in front of you, and you realize something powerful. You were never broken. You were just carrying someone else's weight. This is where it ends.
not with closure, with freedom.